I want to begin by saying Assalamu alaikum, Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak for you, Namaste, praise God, praise the Lord. As the long biography stated, I was principal of a school with immigrant and refugee students from 34 countries, so we learned to greet everybody in their tradition. And we celebrated a holiday every week. You know, it was beautiful fun. My role is to introduce you to our speaker. And you meet people through Zoom, right? And go to meeting, and you're like, let's get this over with, you know. But then, we built this great relationship through Zoom, and it's just grown. And I love my brother because, we travel to Mississippi and Selma, Alabama, and places like that to show students our history. And this brother is right on it, from Jackson, Mississippi, right? So I want to introduce Dr. Wesley R. Bishop. He is Assistant Professor of Public and American History at Jackson State University. He received his BA in History and Psychology from Ohio University in 2009. His MA in History of Social Movements and Labor at Indiana State University in 2014, and his PhD in American History from Purdue University in 2018. Prior to coming to Jackson State University, Dr. Bishop was the Eugene B. Debs Fellow at Indiana State University and an Assistant Professor of History at Marian University. Dr. Bishop's research interests are primarily in public history, specifically public sphere studies. He is interested in how social movements use conceptions of the public and public space to challenge, reshape, and protest society. His first book, Coxey's Army, The Path of Protest from Populism to the New Deal, 1893 through 1936, examines how the 19th century American populist movement reconceptualized concepts of the people, currency, and political protest to create a new relationship between the people and the federal government. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Wesley Bishop.
Thank you all so much. Can you hear me? So I want to begin by thanking all of you for being here. I'm especially grateful to the leadership and staff of the Center for Interfaith Cooperation for their tireless work to bridge differences in and across faith communities through dialogue and education. Their commitment to treating diversity as a civic strength has, over many years, helped foster understanding and peace in the greater Indianapolis community. I would also like to thank the Lilly Endowment for the generous grant that made this series of programs possible, as well as my fellow presenters who will be offering related lectures in the months ahead. Finally, I'm grateful to the staff and leadership of Christ Cathedral for opening their place of worship for this gathering. And so for those of you who, if you're ever interested, this is literally what I get paid to do at Jack State or Jacksonville State University. This is my email up here. I teach classes, I run the public history program, and so literally I get paid to talk to the public. And so please, feel free to reach out if you ever have questions or want to discuss anything. So to begin with, we should ask a very basic question. What do we mean when we talk about religious liberty? And why, on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, do we so often assume that the answer begins there? Historians and critics have long drawn a line between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Yes, I put all of the text up in the paper so that it would be accessible, right? So as I tell students, you don't have to write this all down. I'll just email it to you if you would like it, right? Sometimes treating them as twin pillars of American freedom, and other times as documents in tension with one another. They are related, but they are also profoundly different in purpose and character. The Declaration was, above all, a legal and international statement. It announced that ongoing military and political resistance to the British Empire was not disorder or treason, but part of a deliberate effort to leave that empire and establish a new nation. The Constitution, by contrast, was a document about governance. It restructured political power, replacing a colonial system with a federated republic, and defining how authority should be exercised and constrained. From this difference, a familiar interpretation has emerged. the Declaration is often described as radical, even revolutionary, while the Constitution is framed as conservative, designed to restrain that radical energy. One document, the story goes, unleashed democratic possibility, and the other contained it, placing limits not only on government officials, but also on popular will itself. There is much to debate in that interpretation. But for our purposes today, it obscures more than it reveals. The Declaration does not articulate a doctrine of religious liberty. Its famous opening gestures towards natural rights and divine authority, but it offers no framework for the free exercise of religion. The Constitution, on the other hand, does contain the foundation of what we now call civil liberties, most notably in the First Amendment's protection of religious exercise, or at least in how we have come to understand that protection over time. And this brings us to the heart of this lecture and to the work of the Center for Interfaith Cooperation. Religious liberty exists as an ideal, but it has no single moment of creation. It was not born fully formed in 1776, ratified once and for all in 1788, or settled by any single Supreme Court case. Instead, it has evolved unevenly over centuries. It became a necessity before it became a principle, and over time it took on a near sacred status as a defining feature of American identity. Yet it has never been enjoyed universally, evenly, or without fierce contestation. That contestation did not end in the founding era. It did not end in the 19th century, and it did not end with the expansions of rights in the 20th. It persists well into our own time in the 21st. Consider, for example, the hysteria generated in the early 21st century over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. In 2009, a project known as Park 51 was proposed in Lower Manhattan as an Islamic-led community center and prayer space located several blocks from the World Trade Center site. Its organizers envisioned a mixed-use facility that would include recreational, educational, and interfaith programming, alongside Muslim prayer space. Modeled on existing religious and civic community centers across the city, almost immediately, opponents rebranded the project as the Ground Zero Mosque, a term that was both inaccurate and rhetorically charged. The building was neither at ground zero nor exclusively a mosque, but the label proved effective in mobilizing fear and resentment. What followed was a highly organized national campaign that framed Muslim religious presence itself as a threat, implicitly linking Islam as a faith to terrorism and casting Muslim Americans as perpetual outsiders. Protesters, media figures, and elected officials argued that Muslims should forego their constitutionally protected rights out of deference to national trauma, a demand never imposed on other religious groups. While supporters of Park 51 appealed to the First Amendment and the promise of religious liberty, the controversy exposed how quickly those principles could be subordinated to suspicion, exclusion, and religious intolerance when the faith in question was Islam. The limits of American religious liberty become especially visible when viewed through the experience of Native Americans, for whom religious practice has often been treated not as belief to be protected, but as behavior to be suppressed. In the late 20th century, the Supreme Court repeatedly ruled against Native American religious claims, most notably in Employment Division v. Smith in 1990, which upheld the denial of unemployment benefits to members of the Native American church who used peyote in a religious ceremony. The court reasoned that generally applicable laws could burden religious practice without violating the First Amendment, a logic that effectively stripped constitutional protection from many indigenous traditions. The irony was unmistakable. While peyote was criminalized despite its central sacramental role, Christian practices, such as Catholic children receiving communion wine, were treated as uncontroversial and routinely accommodated. Taken together with earlier decisions limiting Native American claims to sacred land and ceremonial access, these rulings underscore a persistent reality. Religious liberty in the United States has often functioned not as a neutral principle, but as a culturally selective one, extending broad protection to familiar forms of worship while constraining or denying protection to indigenous religious life. Ongoing anti-Semitism in the United States offers another sobering illustration of how fragile religious liberty can be when prejudice is given public license. Despite Judaism being one of the oldest and most established religious traditions in American life, Jewish communities continue to be subject to conspiracy thinking, harassment, and violence. Violence against religious communities further underscores how conditional religious liberty can be in practice. Even groups often perceived as non-threatening or apolitical, such as the Amish, have been targets of hate crimes, including vandalism, harassment, and attacks rooted in resentment of visible differences and separatism. These incidents echo a longer and far more devastating history, most starkly illustrated by the bombing of the Black Baptist churches during the Civil Rights era. The 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which killed 4 young girls, was not only an act of racial terror, but also an assault on religious life itself. Black churches were targeted precisely because they functioned as spiritual, social, and political centers for their communities. Taken together, these examples remind us that religious liberty is is not only threatened only by law or policy, but also by popular acts of terrorism. These examples are only a small sampling of the ongoing struggle to make religious liberty a lived reality for millions of Americans who find themselves, because of race, ethnicity, country of origin, or religious practice, unable to fully enjoy its promised peace and security. They remind us that religious liberty is not merely an abstract constitutional guarantee, but a condition that must be actively protected and negotiated in everyday life. However, before we can hope to address these ongoing issues in any meaningful and informed way, it is useful to return to the 18th century, to the moment when the two documents we most closely associate with American liberty, the Declaration and the Constitution, were first drafted, debated, and contested. Doing so reminds us that religious liberty did not emerge as a fully articulated principle or a settled right. It grew out of practical concerns, political anxieties, and lived conflicts in a deeply divided society. Over time, and often through struggle, those necessities were transformed into an ideal. Understanding that process helps us see religious liberty not as a fixed inheritance, but as a concept shaped by circumstance, compromise, and continual reinterpretation. To understand why religious liberty became a necessity in the 18th century, we must recognize that the founders did not invent the problem of religious conflict, nor did they confront it without precedent. They inherited a world already shaped by experiments in pluralism, confederation, and management of difference. Long before 1776, the Iroquois Confederacy had developed a sophisticated political system known as the Great Law of Peace. This constitution established a federated structure among distinct nations, balancing unity and autonomy while protecting certain forms of internal governance and civil order. Scholars continue to debate the degree to which this confederacy directly influenced the framing of the U.S. Constitution, but what matters for our purposes is not a simple claim of borrowing, but the broader fact that models of federated governance and negotiation coexisted already on this continent. The idea that diverse communities could retain identity while participating in shared political structures was not unprecedented. It was visible and, for some founders, instructive. Within the colonies themselves, figures such as Roger Williams sharpened this necessity into political argument. Banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635 for his dissenting views, Williams founded Rhode Island the very next year on principles of religious tolerance and argued that civil government should concern itself with property and public order, not the salvation of souls. He believed that compelling religious conformity corrupted both church and state. By separating civil authority from ecclesiastical control, Williams sought to protect not only conscience, but also social peace and property. His insistence that the magistrate's authority was limited helped lay the very intellectual groundwork for later arguments about free exercise and disestablishment. Taken together, these examples reveal that religious liberty was born from layered necessities. It was shaped by indigenous models of confederation, haunted by European religious violence, sharpened by colonial dissent, and codified in revolutionary statecraft. It did not emerge as a purely abstract declaration of universal harmony. It arose because pluralism, conflict, and memory made coercive religious conformity both dangerous and unattainable. But if we are looking for a single revolutionary era figure who helps us see religious liberty as a necessity, as a work in progress, and as an ideal, George Mason stands out. Mason was not a systematic theologian, nor was he primarily a philosopher of abstract rights. He was a planner, a legislator, and a political pragmatist operating in a colony fractured by religious hierarchy. To see why religious liberty became a necessity in Virginia, we have to begin with the structure of the colony itself. For much of the colonial period, the Church of England was legally established. Anglican parishes were supported by tax revenue. Vestries exercised significant local authority. Dissenting ministers, particularly Baptists and Presbyterians, were required to obtain licenses to preach, and those who refused could face fines or imprisonment. By the 1760s and 1770s, evangelical revival movements had expanded dramatically in Virginia, creating a large population of dissenters who resented paying taxes to support a church they did not attend. Religious inequality was not theoretical. It was woven into the very law, finance, and local governance. As revolutionary agitation intensified, the colonial leadership faced a practical problem. How could they demand liberty from Britain while maintaining religious coercion at home? It was in this setting that George Mason drafted the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776. Article 16 specifically addressed religion directly. Mason's initial draft language stated that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. During debate, James Madison, a young legislator by that point, proposed a crucial revision, replacing the language of toleration with a stronger formulation. The final text declared that religion could be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. This shift was significant. Toleration implied permission granted by dominant authority. Equal entitlement suggested a right inherent to individuals. The article did not instantly dismantle the Anglican establishment, but it provided a constitutional foundation for doing so. In the years that followed, Virginia moved towards disestablishment, culminating in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786. Mason's work in the Declaration of Rights reveals why religious liberty was a necessity rather than a decorative ideal. Revolutionary leaders in Virginia needed the political support of dissenting communities. They also recognized that continued establishment risked internal divisions at a moment when unity against Britain was essential. Protecting free exercise reduced sectarian grievance and aligned the rhetoric of natural rights with lived experience. At the same time, Mason's language elevated the argument beyond expediency. So, George Mason's influence did not end with the Virginia Declaration of Rights. His articulation of religious liberty as an equal entitlement, grounded in conscience, shaped the political imagination of both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, even where they diverged from him in emphasis or strategy. Mason helped establish the vocabulary through which Virginians would debate church establishment, taxation, and civil liberty. Jefferson and Madison would take that vocabulary and extend it. Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, drafted in 1777 and enacted in 1786, echoes Mason's insistence that belief cannot be compelled. The statute declared that no man should be forced to support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor suffer on account of their religious opinions. Where Mason's language in the Declaration of Rights framed free exercise as an entitlement, Jefferson sharpened the argument by explicitly attacking religious taxation and civil penalties for belief. He expanded the scope from protection of worship to protection of opinion itself. The statute completed in law what Mason had initiated in principle, formally disestablishing the Church of England in Virginia and severing the financial ties between church and state. And as president, Jefferson would go even further, assuring Baptists in Connecticut that the religious persecution they were facing was unfair and in his opinion, un-American, as it violated what he saw a theoretical wall which separated church and state. This is the very famous, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. Madison, for his part, absorbed both Mason's constitutional framing and Jefferson's disestablishment logic. His 1785 memorial and remonstrance against religious assessment argued forcefully that a proposed bill that would have taxed Virginians to support Christian teachers not be passed. Madison's reasoning tracks closely with the trajectory Mason helped set in motion. He insisted that religion is wholly exempt from the cognizance of civil society and that it must be left to the conviction and conscience of everyday individuals. This was not mere toleration. It was a claim about the limits of state authority. Later, as a principal architect of the First Amendment, Madison carried that logic into the federal Constitution, ensuring that Congress could make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And finally, as the so-called founders and framers meet in Philadelphia, right? These converge in the writing of the First Amendment. Now, Mason, what is interesting, did not actually end up signing the Constitution. And his objections to the Constitution were multiple. But central among them was the absence of a Bill of Rights. Mason believed that without explicit protections, the new federal government could threaten the very liberties the Revolution had claimed to secure. Drawing on his experience drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights, he argued that civil liberties, including freedom of religion, should not be left to implication or assumption. The proposed Constitution included structural checks and balances, but it did not enumerate individual protections. To Mason, this omission was dangerous. He feared that a powerful national government, unrestrained by clear limits, might replicate the very abuses Americans had resisted under British rule. Mason's refusal to sign the Constitution placed him among the anti-federalists, who warned that the new system represented an overreach beyond the Convention's charge. Whether or not one agrees with this procedural critique, their alarm produced tangible results. The demand for a Bill of Rights became one of the central conditions for ratification in several states, and in this sense, Mason once again embodied our themes that we're seeing here today. He recognized the necessity of structuring government to preserve liberty. He understood that constitutional design was, in fact, a work in progress, not a finished achievement. And through his insistence on enumerated rights, he helped transform religious liberty and other civil freedoms from state-level commitments to national ideals. The Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment's protection of free exercise, owes much to the pressure exerted by Mason and others who refused to treat liberty as secure simply because American independence had been declared. But even with the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the meaning of federal liberty was far from settled. Almost immediately, a fundamental question emerged. Did the Constitution articulate a shared national ideal that bound the states and protected everyday people, or did it merely limit that federal government, or what that federal government could do, while leaving most questions of rights to state authority? Seems like a very small, like beside the point, but it's actually quite important. Is the Constitution actually applies to people at all levels of society, or is it only something the federal government can't do to you? This became increasingly important as the United States moved into the antebellum period. And you have things like the murder of Elijah Lovejoy in 1837, which crystallized these tensions. Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister and abolitionist editor. He had moved his printing press several times after mobs destroyed it for publishing anti-slavery materials. In Alton, Illinois, a pro-slavery mob attacked the warehouse where his press was stored. Lovejoy was shot and killed while attempting to defend it. In the immediate aftermath, outrage spread across the North. Many framed the killing as a direct assault on freedom of the press and freedom of speech, also in the First Amendment. Yet because Lovejoy's abolitionism was rooted in his religious convictions, the attack also exposed the vulnerability of religious conscience. He was not simply expressing a political opinion. He was acting on what he understood to be a Christian obligation. His death forced Americans to confront whether constitutional liberties were real protections or fragile abstractions that dissolved under local hostility. The location of his murder is telling. Alton sat along the Mississippi River near regions that would witness the violent persecution of Latter-day Saints in Illinois and Missouri. In the same decades that Lovejoy was killed for publishing abolitionist arguments grounded in faith, Mormon communities were being driven from their settlements, their leaders imprisoned, and their property destroyed. These episodes reveal a limited and uneven understanding of constitutional rights in the antebellum republic. If freedom of speech and free exercise bound only the federal government, and if local majorities could intimidate or expel dissenters with impunity, then liberty functioned more as an aspiration than a guarantee. Lovejoy's death and the persecution of Mormons alike exposed a stark reality. The question was no longer abstract. Could a person live out deeply held religious convictions without fear of violence when those convictions challenged dominant social or political norms? The Civil War and Reconstruction Amendments marked a constitutional rupture. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not minor adjustments to the existing framework. They were an attempt to resolve the crisis exposed by slavery and to redefine the relationship between the individual, the states, and the federal government. Most crucial for our purposes is the 14th Amendment. by declaring that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, and that no state could deny any person the equal protection of the laws, it opened the door to a new understanding of rights as national in scope rather than merely federal limitations. Yet the promise of that amendment was not immediately realized. In the late 19th century, the Supreme Court interpreted the 14th Amendment narrowly, and the protections of the Bill of Rights were not automatically applied to the states. For decades, religious liberty and other civil freedoms remained largely dependent on how state law and local practice worked. It was not well into the 20th century, through a doctrine known as incorporation, that the court began applying most provisions of the Bill of Rights to the state via the 14th Amendment's due process clause. Incorporation demonstrated, again, that religious liberty had been a work in progress. Its necessity was recognized in the 18th century, its scope was contested in the 19th, its national enforcement emerged only after the bloodshed of the Civil War and the slow evolution of constitutional interpretation in the 20th and 21st century, really largely in response to the growing civil rights movement. One figure really stands out here, and it is really fascinating if you know anything about him, that he becomes the one who champions this. And it's Hugo Black, right, an Alabama senator and justice who had connections to the Ku Klux Klan. Very, very troubling person. We can talk more about that, right? But he was appointed in 1937, and Justice Hugo Black argued that the 14th Amendment was originally understood to make the entire Bill of Rights binding on the states. In his dissents and concurrences, he maintained that no state shall meant exactly that, and that courts could not pick and choose which rights were fundamental. For Black, incorporation was not judicial creativity, but constitutional fidelity. It was an originalist reading rooted in the debates of Reconstruction and the framers' desire to protect newly freed people from hostile state governments. Beginning with cases like Cantwell v. Connecticut, which applied the Free Exercise Clause to the states, and Neverson v. Board of Education, which incorporated the Establishment Clause, the Supreme Court made clear that religious liberty was not merely a federal restraint. It was a national guarantee. In this way, the 14th Amendment transformed religious liberty from a limitation on Congress into a constitutional promise enforceable against every state and locality. What began in the 18th then as a shield against centralized power became in the 20th a tool to protect minorities from majoritarian rule at every level of government. A careful look at Cantwell v. Connecticut reveals just how fragile religious liberty remained at the state level well into the 20th century. The case arose during the Great Depression in New Haven, Connecticut, when Newton Cantwell and his sons, members of Jehovah's Witness, went door to door in a predominantly Catholic neighborhood distributing literature and soliciting donation. They also had a phonograph where they were saying insults, right, to Catholics. Connecticut law required anyone seeking funds for religious or charitable purposes to obtain a certificate from a state official. That official had the authority to determine whether a cause was religious or legitimate before granting permission. Cantwell refused to apply for the certificate, arguing that the requirement itself violated his freedom of religion. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the constitutional stakes were far larger than a local disturbance. In 1940, the court unanimously reversed Cantwell's conviction. Justice Owen Roberts wrote that the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment protected against state infringement through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. This marked the first time the court explicitly held that the Free Exercise Clause applied to the states. So, we see here one aspect then of the First Amendment, right, of the First Amendment being applied. A similar constitutional turning point came 7 years later in Everson v. Board of Education, a case that forced the Supreme Court to confront the meaning of the Establishment Clause and its application to the states. The controversy arose in Ewing Township, New Jersey, where a local school board authorized reimbursement for transportation costs to parents whose children attended public schools. The program also covered students attending Catholic schools. A taxpayer, Arch Everson, challenged policy, arguing that reimbursing transportation for children attending religious schools amounted to public support of religion and thus violated the First Amendment. The legal question was straightforward but profound. Did the Establishment Clause, which begins, Congress shall make no law respecting and establishing a religion, bind state and local governments? If so, what did it actually prohibit? Writing for a majority, Hugo Black concluded that the Establishment Clause, like the Free Exercise Clause before it, applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. In doing so, the court completed the incorporation of both religious clauses of the First Amendment. Black's opinion is famous in this case for its sweeping historical language. Drawing on the writings of George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, he described the Establishment Clause as erecting, quote, a wall of separation between church and state. That metaphor has echoed through constitutional debates ever since. Yet in the same breath, the court upheld the reimbursement program. It reasoned that payments were made to parents, not directly to religious institutions, and that the policy was neutral, providing a general public benefit to all students regardless of faith. Everson therefore embodies a tension that continues to shape religious liberty jurisprudence all the way to today. On the one hand, it announced a robust principle of separation and firmly nationalized the Establishment Clause. On the other, it permitted a form of indirect aid to religious schools, signaling that strict separation could not always prevail over neutrality. The decision set the stage for decades of litigation that is still ongoing over school prayer, public funding, and the proper relationship between government and religion. In doing so, it illustrates how incorporation did not settle the meaning of religious liberty, but instead opened a new era of constitutional interpretation, one in which the ideal of separation and the practical realities of public life would repeatedly collide. Now, it's important to remember that separation of church and state, what most people think of, like the wall of separating church and state, is not actually a phrase that appears in the Constitution. It comes from Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter describing a wall of separation of church and state to the Danbury Baptists. It was a metaphor later constitutionalized in Everson v. Board of Education by Black. And constitutionally, what we actually have in the Constitution itself are two religious clauses in the First Amendment. The Establishment Clause, which prohibits government from establishing a religion, and second, the Free Exercise Clause, which protects religious practice. Through incorporation under the 14th Amendment, beginning with cases like Cantwell v. Connecticut, those constraints apply not only to Congress, but to states as well. Religious liberty then in the United States operates in two directions. It protects individuals and communities from government interference in belief and practice. It also protects the political community from government favoritism towards a particular faith. The tension is built in. Too much entanglement risks establishment, too much restriction risks suppressing free exercise. So, can public funds flow to religious ventures without violating the Constitution? The Supreme Court, modern answer is yes, right? But under certain conditions. The key principle that has emerged is neutrality. If the government creates a generally available public benefit program and religious institutions qualify on the same terms as secular ones, excluding them solely because they are religious can itself violate the Free Exercise Clause, according to the Supreme Court. At the same time, there remains limits. Government may not directly fund religious worship as such, nor may it coerce participation in religious activity. The older test for the Supreme Court, which as we'll see has been kind of eclipsed, is Lemon v. Kurtzman, which required a secular purpose, a primary effect that neither advanced nor inhibited religion, and no excessive entanglement. Although the court, like I said, has recently moved away from the formal quote-unquote Lemon test, the underlying concerns are the same. So in Lemon v. Kurtzman, the justices announced what would become known as the Lemon test, right? Like I said, these are the three major points, right? So first, right, it has to have a secular purpose, right? Second, it cannot advance nor inhibit a religion. And third, this is what's really interesting, is it can't entangle the government with religion. What had happened is in Rhode Island, there were school teachers, right, who they wanted to use funding to pay their salaries. And the court said it would be impossible to realistically see what dollar is going to what in order to make sure that this is going to math education and not going to religious education. It would entangle the government far too much in the day-to-day operations of a religious activity. So, and like I said, in recent years, the Chief Justice John Court's court, right, has steadily moved away from the Lemon framework. They have instead favored an approach that is what they call more grounded in history, going off of what they see as the original intent of the First Amendment, which itself, as many critics have pointed out, is kind of difficult because, well, who is it? Is it Mason? Is it Madison? Is it Jefferson? Is it Hamilton? Is it Washington? Like, whose actual original intent are we going after? Is it the Danbury Baptist? Is it Patrick Henry, right? Like, who's the actual original intent? But nonetheless, right, this is where we are with the Supreme Court, right? Moving away from the limit test and applying what would be more of a conservative reading of history. So, when I raise this issue with my students, can in fact the government fund a school with public dollars that is religious in nature? It's interesting, right? Many of my students will automatically say, yeah, they're fine with that. They're perfectly fine with funding a religiously based school. They don't see an issue with that. And so if I say, well, for example, if the school's Protestant, do you have a problem with it? And they're like, no, of course not. That's perfectly fine. Many of them, I teach in Alabama, actually went to Protestant private schools. If it's Catholic, right? I say, well, if it's Catholic, are they bothered? There's progress, right? Oh my gosh, like we've come so far since the 18th century, right? They're okay with their tax dollars going to a Catholic school. If I ask them if it's a Jewish school, right? Again, they remain at ease. They have no issue with this going to a well-established religion that they are familiar with. And then I throw this at them. What if there is a hypothetical satanic school in your community? Are you comfortable having your tax dollars go to that school? And it is amazing, right? You just like, the room just goes quiet, right? Or they're like, and they're honest, like, no, actually I have discomfort there. Like, I have discomfort for whatever reason. And therein lies the problem, right? Therein lies the problem with the establishment clause, right? If you start funding certain institutions like this, are you actually willing to apply this evenly, even when it goes against your own religious practice? So that moment of pause is instructive. Religious liberty, if it means anything, must extend beyond the familiar and respectable. A constitutional system built on neutrality cannot operate only when the beneficiaries share our theological assumptions. The question is not whether we approve of a particular belief system. The question is, are we prepared to protect equal access to public benefits, even when doing so unsettles us? That tension exposes the enduring challenge at the heart of religious liberty. It is easy to defend in theory, harder to defend in practice, and hardest of all when it protects those we would rather exclude. So as we stand on the threshold of the nation's 250th anniversary, the story of religious liberty remains unfinished. What began in the 18th century as a practical necessity and a religiously diverse and often fractious society gradually matured into a constitutional ideal. That ideal was refined through the labors of figures like George Mason, sharpened through the conflict in the early Republic, tested in moments of violence such as the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, and expanded through the Reconstruction era amendments and the doctrine of incorporation. It has been interpreted and reinterpreted by generations of jurists, from Hugo's Black insistence that the 14th Amendment nationalized the Bill of Rights, to more recent debates over neutrality, vouchers, and the limits of establishment. If religious liberty is an ideal, it is one forged in conflict. If it is a necessity, it is because pluralism is not optional in the United States. And if it is a work in progress, that is because each generation must decide whether it will narrow the circle of protection or widen it. As we commemorate 2.5 centuries since the Declaration announced that all were created equal, that enduring question is not whether we admire religious liberty in principle, it is whether we are prepared to practice it in full, especially when doing so protects those whose faith, culture, or convictions differ from our own. Thank you.